You are standing in the deepest, most unreachable part of the Congo Basin. Nobody is around for 200 miles. And something just stepped out of the tree line that should not exist. It is 8 feet tall. It walks upright, on 2 legs, the way you do. It looked directly at the armed men in front of it, and it did not run. In 1898, a Belgian officer carried a skull out of this exact stretch of jungle that made scientists in Brussels go quiet. In the mid-2000s, a fully armed research team walked into these same trees and found themselves surrounded by giants who simply refused to flee. So here is the question I need you to hold on to for the next few minutes. If this is only a large chimpanzee, as the official record now claims, why does almost nobody who has actually stood in front of one seem to fully believe that? Before we go back into that jungle, tell me one thing, fast. Drop your city in the comments below. I read every single one. And if verified deep dive mysteries like this are your thing, hit subscribe right now. We go back into the trees immediately after this. It is 1898. King Leopold II's Congo Free State sits at the height of its brutality. Military patrols are pushing into land no European power has ever mapped, forcing local labor, extracting rubber and ivory, and occasionally extracting something else entirely. One Belgian army officer, whose name was never recorded, returns from a routine posting near the Bili-Uélé River carrying something unusual packed into his kit. A skull. Not a gorilla's. Not a chimpanzee's. Something that sits uncomfortably between the two, with a bony ridge running across the top of it like a helmet seam. He hands the skull to the Natural History Museum just outside Brussels, in the town of Tervuren. The curator there is a man named Henri Schouten. Schouten is not a sensationalist. He is a career museum scientist with a reputation for caution. He examines the skull's proportions carefully, measuring the ridge, the jaw, the brow line, and finds that none of it lines up cleanly with anything already in the catalog. In 1898, in an official capacity, he classifies it as physical evidence of an entirely new, giant subspecies of ape, one science had never before documented from this specific stretch of forest. The location matters, so let's be precise about it. This is the Bili-Uélé region, in the far north of what is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It covers roughly 50,000 square kilometers of dense tropical forest bleeding into open savanna, isolated on one side by the wide curve of the Uélé River. Even now, more than a century later, this territory is effectively controlled by local warlords rather than any functioning central government. Very few outsiders go in. Almost nobody who goes in stays long enough to look closely, and the ones who do rarely publish detailed field notes afterward, which is part of why this case has stayed so thin on hard documentation for so long. Colonial record-keeping in this period was inconsistent at best. Specimens moved through military channels, then customs, then whichever museum happened to have a curator willing to examine them. Paperwork was thin. Provenance was often reduced to a single line in a shipping manifest. That is precisely why the surviving trail for this particular skull is so unusual. Most anomalous specimens from this era were lost, mislabeled, or simply thrown away long before a scientist ever laid eyes on them. This one, for whatever reason, survived intact long enough to reach Tervuren and be formally examined. For over a decade after Schouten's classification, the skull sits quietly in a museum drawer while colonial record-keeping stays chaotic and underfunded. But in 1912, a German explorer named Adolf Friedrich publishes a travel account titled Vom Kongo zum Niger und Nil. Inside, it is a photograph that has nothing to do with folklore. It shows a massive ape, shot dead, sprawled across the ground, physically dwarfing the armed hunters standing beside it in the frame. This is a printed, dated, physically documented photograph, appearing in a mainstream European travel book decades before anyone had a word like cryptid to reach for. So by the early 20th century, there are already 2 hard, catalogued, dated pieces of evidence sitting in European archives. A skull that a trained museum curator could not classify as an ordinary species. A photograph of an animal too large for the existing record books. And then, for most of the century that follows, almost total silence on the subject. But it was not the silence of nothing happening out there. It was the silence of nobody going back to look. Fast forward to 1996. A Swiss conservationist and wildlife photographer named Karl Ammann Here's the old stories still circulating among hunters near Bili. Stories that had survived nearly a century with barely any outside attention. Local trackers, according to Amon's own field notes, divided the jungle's primates into two distinct categories, using their own long-standing terminology. The first group they called the tree beaters. These behave like ordinary chimpanzees. When threatened, they climb straight up into the canopy, where hunters bring them down using poison-tipped arrows. Then there is the second group. The trackers called them the lion killers. These animals rarely climbed trees at all. They nested directly on the ground, the way lowland gorillas do, not the way chimpanzees typically do. They were described as darker in color, noticeably heavier, and far more willing to confront a threat head-on than any known chimpanzee population. And according to multiple hunters independently, poison-tipped arrows that reliably killed ordinary chimps did almost nothing to a lion killer. Try to imagine being a local hunter with generations of tracking knowledge, watching your one reliable weapon simply fail to work on an animal you were told was just an ape. What would that do to how you understood the forest around you? Amon's 1996 expedition does not walk away with a clean, tidy answer, but it collects enough physical material, skulls with unusual proportions, ground nests far larger than any documented chimpanzee nest, to convince serious primatologists this was worth committed, long-term study. That study intensifies sharply between 2002 and 2003, when a primatologist named Dr. Shelley Williams travels deep into the Bili forest herself, spending extended stretches embedded with local guides. Williams spent her fieldwork period embedded with local guides who had tracked these animals for years, and it was that local knowledge, more than any lab equipment, that led her team to the right stretch of forest at the right time. According to Williams's later published accounts, she encountered apes standing well over the height of an average adult man, walking upright for sustained distances rather than the brief bipedal bursts typical of chimpanzees. She described flat, wide faces and a straight, heavy brow ridge, unlike the shape found in any standard chimpanzee population she had studied elsewhere. She also reported one specific, difficult-to-shake detail. According to her account, these animals produced a distinct, sustained howling vocalization, one that seemed to intensify specifically around the rising of the full moon and fade again as it set. But it was the next expedition into the same territory that turned an unsettling sighting into something the scientific community could no longer easily set aside. Between 2004 and 2006, a biologist named Dr. Cleave Hicks leads a far larger, far better resource study into the exact same stretch of forest. His team is armed, experienced with wild primate behavior across multiple African countries, and prepared, on paper, for almost anything the Congo basin could show them. According to multiple accounts from members of that expedition, something happened deep in the tree line that none of them had fully prepared for. Set the scene. It is deep in the wet season. Visibility under the canopy drops to a few dozen meters in places. Humidity sits heavy enough to fog a camera lens within minutes. The team is moving slowly, tracking fresh signs, broken branches at chest height, disturbed leaf litter, the faint, unmistakable smell of a large animal somewhere close. Every member of the team is carrying field weapons, standard practice for expeditions into territory known to hold leopards and forest buffalo. Nobody on that team, according to later interviews, expected the weapons to matter for the primates they were tracking. Ordinary wild chimpanzees anywhere else in Africa do exactly what field guides predict around armed, unfamiliar humans. They vanish. They avoid confrontation at almost any cost, retreating into the canopy long before a human eye ever finds them. The animals Hicks's team encountered did the opposite. According to the expedition's own field reports, they did not flee. They approached. They moved through the dense understory, closing the distance, and began to surround the research team at close range, watching the humans with what multiple witnesses on the expedition independently described as cold, calculated curiosity, rather than fear or aggression. No known documented population of wild chimpanzees behaves this way toward armed human strangers. Not one, anywhere else on the continent. Stop. That single detail, a supposedly ordinary chimpanzee population actively surrounding an armed research team instead of scattering, is the exact detail that has kept this case circulating in both scientific and cryptozoology circles for 2 decades. Physical evidence gathered during this period backs up the behavioral reports directly. Hicks's team and researchers working alongside him photographed and measured footprints reaching 14 inches in length, larger than a documented adult silverback gorilla's footprint. They mapped and measured ground nests substantially larger than any chimpanzee nest previously recorded in the scientific literature. Whatever these particular animals ultimately turn out to be, they were leaving a consistent, physically measurable signature across one very specific, very isolated stretch of forest. What makes this case different from a typical cryptid story is how many separate, unconnected threads all point back to the same place. Let's line them up. First, the indigenous testimony. This did not begin with any Western scientist. Local hunting communities near the Bili-Uélé River had their own detailed classification system, the tree beaters and the lion killers, generations before Carl Ammon ever arrived with a camera. Oral tradition in this region also describes forest beings that predate any of the 20th century expeditions by a considerable stretch, according to accounts collected by later researchers working alongside regional guides. Second, the documented physical trail. We already have the 1898 skull examined and formally classified by Henri Schouteden at the Tervueren Museum. We have the 1912 photograph published in Adolf Friedrich's own travel account. We have Ammon's 1996 field material. We have Hicks's measured footprints and mapped nests from the mid-2000s. That is 4 separate, dated, physically documented pieces of evidence spread across more than 100 years, collected by different people who had no contact with one another. Third, the behavioral consistency. Every single account, across every decade, describes the same core behavior, an animal that does not flee from armed humans, and in some cases actively approaches them instead. Fear of humans is not a minor detail in primate behavior. It is one of the most consistent, most deeply conditioned traits in almost every wild ape population on Earth. An entire regional population missing that trait, generation after generation, is itself the anomaly, regardless of what the DNA eventually says. Put those 3 threads together: independent oral history, a physical evidence trail spanning more than a century, and one consistent behavioral pattern nobody can fully explain, and you start to understand why this case refuses to quietly close. Quick pause before we go further. What do you personally think these are? An unusually large, isolated chimpanzee population? Or something science has not fully accounted for yet? Drop your answer below. Now, let's look at exactly what the official record says, and where it starts to fall short. Here is where a single strange story turns into something closer to a documented pattern, rather than a scattered rumor. These reports are not one account, from one man, on one night. They span 3 independently led research efforts. Ammon in 1996, Williams in 2002 and 2003, Hicks between 2004 and 2006, across nearly a full decade, all converging on the exact same 50,000 square kilometer stretch of forest. Indigenous trackers who had never spoken to any of these Western scientists were describing the same 2-tier division. Tree beaters against lion killers, long before a single outside expedition arrived to write any of it down. That geographic clustering is significant on its own. The unusual sightings, the oversized ground nests, the 14-inch tracks, none of it is scattered randomly across the wider Congo basin. It concentrates specifically around the Bili-Uélé River drainage, in terrain that was difficult to reach in 1898, and, because of ongoing conflict involving armed rebel factions and illegal gold mining operations, has remained difficult to reach ever since. A pattern that stays confined to one specific, hard-to-access location is considerably harder to wave away as coincidence or repeated misidentification than a set of scattered, unrelated stories would be. 3 separate, independently led research efforts spread across roughly a decade, all converging on the same isolated patch of forest. How do you explain that pattern with coincidence alone? So let's walk through the leading explanations honestly, one at a time, without picking a side before we've looked at each of them fairly. The Congo Basin is the 2nd largest rainforest on Earth and large sections of it remain genuinely unmapped by modern science even today. It is entirely plausible that a geographically isolated chimpanzee population developed distinct size and behavioral traits over many generations of separation from other groups, in a region with abundant food and minimal outside pressure. This is, notably, the explanation mainstream primatology ultimately settled on. Supporters of this theory point out that isolated island and forest populations of many species routinely diverge in size from their mainland relatives, a well-documented pattern in evolutionary biology, and there is no obvious reason chimpanzees would be exempt from it. In the early 2000s, some researchers speculated these animals might represent something closer to a chimpanzee-gorilla hybrid population, or possibly a poorly documented relict hominid lineage surviving in an unusually isolated pocket of forest. This theory struggles badly against the DNA testing that came later, since hybridization across that particular species boundary is not supported by the genetic data collected. But it does account cleanly for the extreme reported size and the ground nesting behavior, a trait strongly associated with gorillas and rarely seen in chimpanzees, which is exactly why it persisted in serious scientific discussion for as long as it did. Decades of civil conflict emptied large portions of this forest of regular human traffic for extended stretches at a time. It's plausible that prolonged isolation from human contact, paired with abundant prey and minimal competition from other predators, allowed an existing chimpanzee population to grow both physically larger and behaviorally bolder over time, which would help explain both the size and the near-total absence of fear around armed humans. Under this theory, the lion killer behavior is not a different species at all, but a learned generational confidence that simply never had a reason to fade. There is one more angle here, and it is the one that keeps this particular case circulating online, decades after Hicks's findings were first published. In 2006, DNA testing performed on fecal samples collected from the region concluded that these animals were, genetically, eastern chimpanzees, specifically the subspecies Pan troglodytes schweinfurthi. Mainstream science largely treated this as the closing chapter of the story, but critics of that conclusion raise a fair, specific point. A DNA match alone does not on its own explain every physical detail researchers had already documented in the field. It does not explain 14-inch footprints. It does not explain a skull carrying a pronounced sagittal crest, the kind of bony ridge typically associated with gorillas rather than chimpanzees. It does not fully explain sustained ground nesting behavior in an animal, supposedly no different from tree-nesting chimpanzee populations living only a few hundred miles away. None of these specific, physically measured details are resolved by a genetic match by itself, and that unresolved gap is exactly what keeps the wider debate alive today. It's worth noting that this kind of gap between a genetic result and unresolved physical evidence is not unique to this case. It shows up periodically across cryptozoology-adjacent research, and it is usually where the most productive, evidence-based debate actually happens, rather than in the initial sighting itself. To be clear about where the evidence actually stands, this is a genuine, ongoing debate, not a confirmed cover-up. The current scientific consensus is that these are unusually large, isolated eastern chimpanzees. What remains genuinely open, even among researchers who accept that classification, is why this specific population grew so unusually large, why it behaved so differently from every other studied chimpanzee group on the continent, and why the physical evidence it left behind still puzzles some of the very researchers who examined it firsthand. Stay with me, because the most recent piece of this story only surfaced a few months ago, and it connects directly back to the exact detail we opened this video with. If you've made it this far, thank you. Genuinely, hit that like button right now if this has you thinking. Now, let's go back into the forest one last time. This next part needs a clear label before we go any further, because I want to be straight with you about where the evidence stands. What you are about to hear is unverified. It has not been confirmed by any named research institution, and everything before this point in the video came from documented, named, dated sources. This part is different, and it deserves to be treated differently. In March of 2026, footage began circulating online, allegedly showing thermal drone sweeps recorded near a location referred to only as Sector 7. somewhere within the wider Bili-Uélé swamp region of the Congo Basin. The footage's original source has not been confirmed by any credentialed party. The claims attached to it online describe a primate figure roughly 10 feet tall, with an alleged 0% genetic match to any currently known ape species. I want to say this plainly and without hedging. There is no verified chain of custody for this footage, no named researcher publicly attached to it, and no peer-reviewed data backing the genetic claim in any capacity. It should be treated as unverified online lore, not documented fact, exactly the same way this entire investigation has tried to treat every claim along the way, from the 1898 skull onward. But here is why the claim will not simply disappear. It lines up almost exactly with the detail that opened this entire video. An 8-foot figure, bipedal, standing its ground near an armed human presence rather than fleeing from it. The same general physical profile Dr. Shelley Williams described in 2003. The same fearless confrontational behavior Dr. Cleave Hicks's team documented between 2004 and 2006. The same broad region first flagged more than a century earlier by an unnamed Belgian officer carrying a strange skull out of the jungle in 1898. Whether or not the 2026 footage turns out to be genuine, the underlying pattern behind it predates it by well over a century. A skull in 1898, a photograph in 1912, footprints and eyewitness testimony in 1996, a direct face-to-face encounter with an armed research team in the mid-2000s, and now unverified footage circulating in 2026, describing the exact same physical profile all over again, in the same corner of the world. That is not, on its own, proof of any hidden species, and it should not be treated as one. But it is 128 years of a remarkably consistent account, coming from people, colonial museum curators, Swiss conservationists, trained primatologists, indigenous hunters with no outside agenda, who had no meaningful reason to coordinate a story with each other, working decades apart, in some cases without ever knowing the other's accounts existed at all. If the 2026 footage is eventually traced to a real source, it will either confirm what witnesses have been describing since 1898, or it will turn out to be an elaborate misunderstanding built on genuine, older evidence. Either outcome says something honest about this case. It is not a story invented out of nothing for online attention. It is a 100-year-old documented pattern that occasionally gets a new, harder to verify layer added on top of it, the way most long-running unexplained cases eventually do. So where does that actually leave us? Official science currently holds that these are simply large, isolated eastern chimpanzees, and that conclusion may well be entirely correct. It is the most evidence-based explanation available right now, backed by direct genetic testing, and it deserves to be treated with exactly that weight. But it is still worth asking, honestly, why so many of the trained observers who actually stood in that forest, armed field researchers, generations of indigenous trackers, a cautious colonial-era museum curator with no cryptozoology agenda whatsoever walked away describing something that felt, to them personally, categorically different from an ordinary chimpanzee they already knew well from elsewhere. Maybe that gap is simply what sustained fear, adrenaline, and genuine isolation due to trained human perception, even in observers who consider themselves reliable. Or maybe an animal can be genetically, technically classified as a known species, and still represent something science has not fully accounted for, not in its DNA, but in how it looks, how it behaves, and specifically, why it appears to have stopped being afraid of us at all. There is a version of this story where the ending is simple: a large isolated ape, a DNA test, a closed file. And there is another version, held quietly by some of the very people who spent months in that forest, where the file was never really closed at all, just set down because the terrain made it too dangerous to keep asking questions. Both versions can be true at the same time. That is usually how the real unresolved cases look, once you strip away the parts of the story built for effect. I am not going to answer that question for you tonight. Honestly, I don't think anyone can answer it with full confidence yet. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and I'd genuinely like to know what you think. If the laboratory result says chimpanzee, but nearly every trained person who has ever stood face to face with one describes something categorically different, Which piece of evidence should we actually trust more? The lab result or the witness standing in the trees? Now I want to hear directly from you. Which explanation do you personally believe? The isolated chimpanzee or something the classification still hasn't caught up with? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I mean that literally, not as a line to close out the video. We set a small, simple goal for this video, and if we crossed it, that tells me to keep digging deeper into cases exactly like this one going forward. Next time, we head somewhere just as remote and just as unresolved. A different continent, a very different kind of encounter, and a case file that stayed sealed for almost 60 years before anyone outside a small circle of officials was ever allowed to read it. If tonight's story kept you watching until the end, that one will too. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. I'll see you back in the trees.